Before we jump into today's episode, please remember this podcast is not therapy and it doesn't replace working with a qualified professional. While I aim to keep things grounded in science and offer a lot of educational insight, the content here should never be generalized. Everyone's experience is different. If you're experiencing any mental or medical distress, please reach out to a licensed provider who can support your specific needs. Welcome back to ADHD Realities. I'm your host, Dr. Leanne Borneman, clinical sexologist, ADHD relationship and sexuality expert. And this is the podcast we talk all things ADHD and sexuality in ways research is still lacking. So join me in today's episode and let's jump in. Today we are diving into a topic that gets people fired up. It gets people to shut down. I know I may piss a lot of people off today because we're going to be talking about porn and masturbation. And I'm going to give a disclaimer that one of the reasons I feel very comfortable and confident to know that this can generate a variety of different emotions is because we are so much more attached to this concept of porn and masturbation from a belief system rather than a fact system. So subjectivity versus objectivity. And I want to set the record straight from the start here that in my clinical work with well over 100 men that I've worked with and couples, I've yet to meet a single one whose actual problem was the masturbation itself. What I've actually seen over and over and over again is that the real struggle comes from the shame, the secrecy, the beliefs that people are carrying about what masturbation or porn means to them, to society. So today, we're unpacking all of it because we're going to talk about what the research actually says, why a variety of different claims, one of which is like porn is rewiring your brain, aren't actually supported by evidence. How moral incongruence fuels the distress that a lot of people experience, and why shame is usually one of the heaviest loads people are carrying in this area specifically. And my hope is that by the end of all of this, you may start to see masturbation less like a dangerous habit and more like going for a walk. Bear with me. More like a walk in the sense of it being normal, healthy, and only problematic when it gets tangled up with shame and unrealistic expectations. So sit back, buckle that seatbelt, because we're going to get into it. So we have to start somewhere, and I always love to start with the science because we have so many myths in society around this concept. And I'm actually going to go through 4 of the most popular claims that I've jotted down over the years working with tons of people that come into my practice that I kind of want to unpack. And one of the first ones that I think is the most common is this idea that if you watch porn, it's going to rewire your brain. And when we look at the research, the reality is that sexual stimulation is going to activate your brain's reward system, just like food, music, or even laughter. And so what that means is that dopamine reinforcement and learning also is occurring. But that in itself isn't a damage. That's the biology. The biology doing what it's supposed to do. So research doesn't show harmful rewiring. What it shows is normal reward pathways responding to sexual stimuli. Again, the unhealthy side of things stemming from a belief, not your body, your anatomy, objectivity-wise. Another really popular one that comes through the door is that porn is going to cause erectile dysfunction. And this one gets repeated constantly, but when you actually look at the studies, the evidence is weak and very inconsistent on this front because large reviews don't actually support this direct causal link, right? What does end up showing up when we are looking at the literature is that factors like the shame, the secrecy, the relational conflict, or unrealistic expectations, all of those are far more predictive of difficulties with arousal or even performance than porn itself gets to hold weight to. Another one is that porn is addictive. Now, this one is going to piss off a lot of people, and I already know that. We have a split between, in my field, of people who believe in something called sex addiction, porn addiction, and then you have people like myself who do not subscribe to that belief system, because when we do look at the science, it just doesn't support it as an addiction. When we look at the medical jargon and understanding of what addiction really is. And when we look at the DSM-5, it does not include porn addiction as a diagnosis. However, when we do look at the ICD-11, which is another diagnostic criteria for people in the field, it does include something called compulsive sexual behavior disorder. But it's very, very specific. And it explicitly says that distress caused only by moral or cultural beliefs doesn't count as a disorder. That is a critical piece. Because if someone feels bad about porn only because their community told them it's sinful or wrong, that doesn't make it a disorder. It doesn't make it an addiction. It makes it an unhealthy relationship. But where is the unhealthy relationship connected to? The act itself or the belief system? Now, I'm going to pause here for a second because I think it's important to say every person's experience is going to be nuanced and layered. And everything I'm saying right now can never be generalized. But what I am doing is bringing the facts here, the objective lens here, for those individuals who are experiencing any level of uncertainty, discomfort, distress around the concept of porn and masturbation, whether it be for you individually, or maybe you're in a relationship and your partner is doing this, or you're the partner and you're experiencing this and you're struggling. At the end of the day, I'm again pausing here. If you are experiencing any distress, any concerns, do not try to self-treat, self-diagnose, keep it in. Go seek a qualified support system. I felt important to say that. Now I'm going to keep going. And I'm going to go on to the last thing that comes through the door so quite often around this, is that porn leads to violence or distorted sexual attitudes. Now, when again we lean into the research here is very mixed, okay? Some studies are showing correlations, but again, we have to pull context because context matters, nuance matters, and that context here is the type of porn, the frequency, and more importantly, the viewer's pre-existing attitudes going into it. It's not as simple as porn just causes violence, because in fact, causality hasn't even been established. And again, everyone's experience is nuanced. There are tons of people that can engage in porn and never, ever hold any level of violence. And kink and BDSM porn isn't by default violence. Because if it's intentional and consensual, it has nothing to do with violence. And that's also another layer here that needs a little bit more understanding. So to sum all of that up, the blanket statement of, porn is harmful, it's just not supported strongly when we are looking at and leaning into the peer-reviewed evidence. And what we actually see is that porn and masturbation become problems only in certain contexts. And those contexts are often when shame and secrecy and moral conflict are driving the distress. I'm also going to be putting, by the way, everything in terms of all the references used to do this episode today in the description. Felt important to say that. And this just goes to show your girl over here, ADHD, prime vibing, not having any structure here. I try, but sometimes I fail. Because again, your girl, neurodivergent. So to better also then understand claims that have been made in the practice that are very common for a lot of people, there's this term called moral incongruence, and it's really important to unpack and better understand, and it's an area of education I provide all of my clients when working on these things, because it is one of the bigger factors that ends up showing up in both the research and the work I do. But when we look at moral incongruence, it is talking about when your behaviors or your behavior conflicts with your values or your beliefs, or the values or beliefs of society in terms of what you have taken as well. So if someone, let's say, was raised to believe that masturbation is sinful, well, they end up masturbating anyway. The distress they're going to feel doesn't come from the act itself. It's coming from that clash between belief and the behavior. And when we do look into the research has shown that moral incongruence is one of the strongest predictors of whether someone views their porn use as problematic or views their partner's porn use as problematic. And it's not the frequency of porn use that ends up predicting this distress. It's whether their use is going to align with or violate their personal or cultural values. And when I use a clinical lens, this shows up constantly. And I have to stress, it's both the person engaging in porn use and masturbation and also their partners. Sometimes the person who's engaging in porn and masturbation doesn't have a moral incongruence issue. It's their partner that does. And then that leads to shame and secrecy, which I'm going to get to in a little bit. But when we look at individuals who are coming into my practice, at least, I have men come into therapy saying, porn is ruining my life. I'm like, okay, let's dig a little bit here. Because once we end up digging deeper, what's actually ruining their life is the shame script they've internalized, or the shame script that is being forced upon them by their partner. They've been told that masturbation is making them weak, it's making them selfish, it's making them sinful. And that belief creates enormous anxiety, enormous guilt, and then secrecy. And one of the biggest important components here is that beliefs aren't neutral. They end up shaping how we experience our sexuality. Because if you were raised in a household where, let's say, solo sex was never talked about, or worse, excuse me, it was condemned, and then every time you masturbate, you're not just having a physical release. You're also carrying the weight of that moral story. And that ends up what drives the distress, not the orgasm. And within this frame of reference, there's a lot of classical conditioning going on here. That's really important. So now going back to the shame piece, because that's where this all brings us. Shame thrives in silence. And in my work, the men who are struggling most with the masturbation aren't struggling with the act itself. They're struggling with hiding it. They're lying to themselves, lying to their partners, then drowning in this guilt. And that secrecy creates this very vicious cycle. You feel bad, you hide, the hiding makes you feel worse, and then the behavior escalates because it's tied to secrecy and a relief. And this is where, again, research, it backs this up. Because studies are consistently showing that physiological distress around porn is strongly linked to shame and secrecy, not frequency of use. Once shame is reduced, what looked like compulsive use often begins to decrease naturally. I see this all the time in my practice. Because I've had clients who went from thinking they were addicted to porn to realizing they were addicted to secrecy. Once they stopped hiding and started integrating solo sex into their self-care without the guilt, talking to their partners and finding communication that was needed all along to figure a collaborative, respectful approach, the distress almost disappeared. And it takes time, because learning something, you have to unlearn it, and that takes some time. And when we look at shame, it distorts everything. It makes a healthy, normal behavior feel pathological. And that distortion is far more damaging, I feel confident to say, with the research, than masturbation ever could be. And I will say here that not everyone is going to have a happy ending. No pun intended here. If you are in a relationship, you can't force someone to unlearn a belief system. They don't have to. And so what that means is that not everyone is going to be on board with shifting. And then the unfortunate truth behind that is that sometimes that means you are not in a relationship that is going to thrive and support a healthy, explorative, oh my God, I can't talk, way of going about things. That is also a reality. Thankfully, I have not worked with a lot of those cases, but they are out there. But you can't find out if your case is that case until you really talk about it with a qualified professional, because I can't speak volume to that part. If you didn't go to school for this, if you are not educated this, and you're struggling with your own belief systems, what the fuck makes you think you're going to be able to unpack all of this on your own effectively, productively? And that doesn't mean you're a failure. It doesn't mean that something's wrong with you. It means that you didn't go to school for this shit and you need to go to somebody that can help navigate it. Now, with everything, we have to make a shift and reframe, okay? Because, again, masturbation isn't a moral failure, unless you believe it is, right? Again, when we look at the science, we look at things objectively, it's regulation, it's release. And sometimes it's just plain pleasure. And for many people, it's also a way to maybe, let's say, manage stress or fall asleep or reset emotionally or tickle the boredom. You do a variety of things to tickle boredom. Why does porn use or masturbation get thrown into a negative outlet? Oh, I'll tell you why, because there's a belief system attached to it. Anything sexual is taboo in this country, in most countries. But the realities are, is it? No, it's not unhealthy. But we live in a society that has seen it as such. And solo sex in itself and partnered sex are not competitors. And that's a huge thing. Because they're parts of a healthy sexual ecosystem where masturbation doesn't take away from a partner. Unless the relationship script and the expectations that you have in place are making it into a betrayal. This is where that conversation piece is really big. Because some people are not going to be okay changing the script and the expectation if they truly believe it's a betrayal. Whether that belief is supported by objective realities or not, it's still their belief. They have every right to hold a belief system. And that's also where moderation can also become misunderstood. Because when we look at this concept of moderation, it doesn't mean limit it to 3 times a week or 2 times a week or 4 times a week. Moderation actually means, is this interfering with your functioning? Is it taking away from relationships, from work, from your health? If not, then it's just another way of taking care of your body. I know, mind blown, right? So where does this leave us? The research just doesn't support the blanket claims that porn is harmful. It just doesn't. What it does show is that the distress is more often going to be rooted in that moral incongruence, the shame, the secrecy. And clinically, I've seen that masturbation itself is rarely the problem. This is where, the real rewiring that needs to happen isn't in your brain. It's in the cultural and personal scripts that we've been handed about sexuality. So I'm going to leave you with this. If you feel distressed about porn, masturbation, both, ask yourself, Is the distress coming from the behavior or from the beliefs you've inherited? That reflection alone, it can start to loosen the grip of shame. It can also feel very confusing and alone. This is, again, where working with a qualified professional is going to be huge. But it's not impossible. As always, I hope this was helpful. Another layer of education, objectivity. As always, thanks for joining me in my rant, my educational spews. And if, again, this episode gave you something to think about, share it with someone. Share it with your partner, your girlfriend, your wife, your husband, your partner, whomever. Whoever you think would benefit from re-examining the shame scripts that we have all been handed. And remember, your sexuality, it deserves curiosity, not condemnation. Thanks so much for joining me for today's episode, and if you enjoyed what you heard or something really resonated with you, it would mean the world if you subscribed, shared it with a friend, or left a review. That's how we keep these conversations going and growing. And until next time, take care of yourself and keep showing up in ways that matter to you, but more importantly, work with your brain and not against it.